3, 2, 1, live.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Vacroux, the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And I'm thrilled to have you join us today for our discussion of Russian environmental activism. We're co-sponsoring this event with the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and many thanks to Jim Clem for organizing this with us. Those of us watching Russia have noticed a significant uptick in environmental protests. Actually, there's been an uptick in all sorts of protests, most recently triggered by Navalny. But today we're going to look at what's driving local protests against threats to the environment and how the state is reacting. My guest today is very well posed to discuss this. Dr. Elizabeth Plantan is an associate professor of political science at Stetson University. Her research interests include the global study of civil society, authoritarian regimes, and environmental politics, with a particular focus on China and Russia. And her current book project is examining and comparing environmental activism in China and in Russia. Elizabeth, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share some slides. I do have some comments that are prepared as a presentation at the beginning of this talk, and then I look very much forward to questions. As Dr. Vacroux just mentioned, I will be speaking about my broader work. So the presentation today brings together several different strains of that work related to environmental activism in Russia and how we have seen it evolve over time. First, the motivation is very much along the lines of what was just said, is that if you follow Russian politics in the news, you have probably seen environmental movements run across the headlines much more than they used to. And so what is driving this major mass mobilization for the environment? Is this something new? What have we seen come before? What is different about this moment? And so this is really the motivation for the talk today. And there are three driving questions that we'll be looking at together in the next 30 minutes or so. How has environmental activism evolved in Russia over the last decade? And to do that, I need to tell you something about what it was like before. Why is this decade different? And I do think that it is. Then, how has the state reacted to the growing environmental movement? And then how have activists themselves reacted to that state response? It's a bit of an interaction between state and society there. And finally, this is a new part of my research, looking at how environmental activism intersects with formal party politics in Russia, and especially ahead of the 2021 Duma elections, that this may be of interest to those who are looking forward to those elections in September. First, a timeline of environmental activism to try to catch you up to speed on how we have seen environmental activism evolve over time from the late Soviet period into the post-Soviet Russian period. Although environmental activism in the Soviet Union certainly existed before 1986, one of the major catalysts for the late Soviet environmental movement, the late Soviet anti-nuclear movement in particular, was the Chernobyl accident. So the Chernobyl accident really gave rise to mass mobilization, not just around anti-nuclear politics, but around environmental politics in general, especially because it coincided with Glasnost. And so there were several people within the Soviet environmental establishment that were then able to start expressing some of their grievances that they had noticed, environmental problems that they had noticed, not just nuclear. That has also been, the late Soviet anti-nuclear movement has also been credited in some work to providing sort of a Trojan horse for the nationalist mass mobilization at the end of the Soviet Union that then contributed to the collapse. So even as the Soviet Union was collapsing, a lot of these early leaders of the late Soviet environmental movement started to create their own organizations. They weren't registering them as NGOs at that time, but they were sort of proto-NGOs. Some of those leaders that came out of that mass mobilization were thinking about how to sustain that momentum and creating their own organizations. Fast forward to the 1990s, in the post-Soviet period, post-Soviet Russia, that these organizations that had started, maybe even in the late years of the Soviet Union, were really scrambling to find state support for their activities. They weren't necessarily getting any interference from the state either. And so scholars have talked about this period as one of benign neglect, where the state was neither supporting nor constraining environmental activism. And so it's a time where we saw a lot of environmental NGOs formalize and register as formal professionalized organizations with leaders that came out of that late Soviet period. But because the state was not helping them in any way, we also saw then environmental activists start to lean on foreign funding.
Elizabeth, can I stop you just for a second? We're getting a lot of fuzz. I think it's from your microphone, maybe rubbing against your sweater.
Oh, that is possible. Yes, because there's a
Right.
microphone on these. Let me take it off. I put on the headphones because my computer speakers are not as good as the headphones, but thank you.
No problem. No problem.
All right. So I was talking about environmental NGOs getting a lot of foreign funding in the 1990s. Because they weren't getting much attention from the state, they started to lean on that foreign funding. And foreign funders also gave them the opportunity to increase their capacity building, become professionalized Western-style NGOs. That came with some consequences as well, that they started to move away from that community-based organizing towards professional, donor-driven priorities, and there's been a lot of great work on that. That feeling of benign neglect from the state really changed with the rise of Putin in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s in particular, with increased regulations such as the amendments in 2006 to the NGO law. This applied to NGOs in general, but of course it also affected the fledgling environmental NGOs at the time. One of the other things that I want to point out is that from the late Soviet period into the chaos of the 1990s, the post-Soviet Russian period, the environmental movement lost a lot of momentum. And so it had been a movement with a lot of public participation, with a lot of mass potential that it lost in the post-Soviet period as people were rightly concerned about other things. This is something where I think we've really started to see a change. 2010 for me is a very important turning point for several reasons. The first is that we saw one of the largest mass protests in the post-Soviet period in Russia related to the environment with the Khimki forest movement. For those who maybe aren't as familiar with this movement, this was a local grassroots movement against a highway that was supposed to bifurcate Khimki forest, which is in a northwestern suburb of Moscow. And in part because of where it was and when it was, this got a lot of attention. And in August of 2010, they organized a rally that attracted more than 5,000 people. It was one of the largest environmental protests in post-Soviet Russia. What also happened that year were forest fires in Moscow Oblast where the smoke even reached the capital. And so there was this environmental movement to protect a forest fires that were raging, and people joined a voluntary movement to help fight these forest fires. And so we're seeing environmental activism on the streets, people that are starting to get involved in citizen activism and volunteering as a result of forest fires. And then that leads into the 2011-2012 political protests. And so there was a lot of environmental mass mobilization that was happening in the 2010s that then also fed into the 2011-2012 political protests. And I'll talk more about that nexus between environmental activists and political parties near the end of this talk. But I wanted to give you a bit of motivation for why I think this decade is so different, because we hadn't seen in the post-Soviet period the environmental movement regain its mass momentum in the way that we have in the last decade. So the environmental movement has gained higher levels of public attention and participation in this last decade, but the state still largely neglects or represses environmental groups. It has pushed, that state response, I think, has pushed environmental activists to remain informal and to rely on mass mobilization, which creates additional consequences for the state and for activists. It has also created new opportunities for environmental activism to intersect with formal party politics. So the data that I draw on for today's talk, and in general in the Q&A, is from over 90 interviews that I've conducted in Russia with Russian activists from 2015 to 2020. Some of the interviews that were done in 2020 were remote. Otherwise, it was in fieldwork based in Russia. I also will be referring to an original data set that I collected of NGOs listed as foreign agents through December of last year, to make a point about environmental activists and how they've been caught up with the foreign agent law. And then of course, I'm also looking at secondary sources to triangulate all of that material to provide some additional data. So environmental awareness in Russia has increased in recent years as one of the major changes of this past decade of environmental activism. What you see on the slide is a headline about a poll that was done by the Institute of Environment at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow that found that 94% of Russians are concerned about the environment. Even when Russians are comparing environmental issues to other things that they're worried about, it comes up at the very top. So a Levada survey that was released in January of 2020 had respondents list what their top global threats were, the top threats facing the world today, which are the most dangerous. And there are two environmental themes that came up in that list. Environmental pollution being number one, and climate change even shows up in that top five, which is a big change for how environmental issues have been viewed in Russia, in particular climate change, that we have typically seen that Russians are less interested in climate change than other European publics, for example. And that environmental awareness has also helped fuel mass environmental protest in Russia. And so pictured on the slide here are protesters in Yekaterinburg who are tearing down a fence in a park where a church was planned. And there were several similar park movements all around Russia, protecting parks from illegal construction or maybe building dachas illegally in parks for elected officials, that ended up with clashes between protesters and security forces. That leads to the next question of how the state has reacted to this growing environmental movement. If we're seeing people who are more aware, more willing to protest for environmental causes, how is the state handling that? First, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the theoretical basis from my other work about how authoritarian leaders manage civil society. So rather than a policy of blanket repression, authoritarian leaders are balancing between liberalization and control. And that leads them to try to balance between the benefits and risks of civil society. So on the one hand, civil society actors could give information about governance. They could help improve governance by providing public services, but they could also pose risks if they get out of control. If that mass mobilization then poses a threat of regime toppling mass mobilization, for example. So how do they balance between these different pressures of the benefits and risks of civil society? So I've argued in some of my other work, an article in particular that's forthcoming in Comparative Politics, about the four typical responses that authoritarian regimes can use when they're responding to civil society. That for groups that are seen as high benefit and high risk, authoritarian regimes will try to co-opt or channel them. For those that are seen as high benefit but low risk, that's a great place to encourage them, particularly to take up things like providing public services, that's something the state doesn't have to do if it encourages civil society organizations to do that. For groups that are lower benefit but high risk, this is where we would tend to see repression of groups. And then where groups are both low benefit and low risk, the state doesn't want to pay that much attention to them at all, and so they'll be neglected. And so how does this apply to environmental activism in Russia? So we've seen attempts of the state to co-opt or channel environmental groups through things like institutions to channel civil society participation in governance, like the Presidential Council on Civil Society and Human Rights, like the Общественные советы, the social councils that are attached to various ministries and agencies. Some of those are environmental agencies that have these councils. But in my interviews with environmental activists, they'll try to use these channels, but find them extremely ineffective. This is a quote on the slide that illustrates this. One representative of a domestic environmental NGO in Western Siberia said, all the structures were created by the authorities, all of these institutions. And using an instrument that was created to be controlled by the authorities to control the authorities is pointless. Pointing out that, if the state's creating these channels, they aren't meant for real change, that they're not working the way that they say that they're supposed to on paper. We also see limited encouragement of environmental groups. There have been some changes to NGO laws to allow for easing registration requirements and other tax burdens and things like that on socially oriented NGOs. But it can be difficult for environmental NGOs to figure out how to get that status. Some of them have applied for presidential grants to get funding from the federal government for their work. This is data that I collected on applications from Russian environmental NGOs for presidential grants. It shows you the total number of grants and then the number that were successful. Certainly they're competitive grants, not all of them were going to win, but it's a small number who actually do get these grants, and the grants tend to be quite small in the amount. So in talking to environmental groups about these grants, they'll say, yeah, sure, we got this, but this doesn't even pay our rent for the year. It's not enough to sustain us. It's not really a viable option for a lot of these groups, and it could go away, is the other concern with it. Instead, we've largely seen the state neglect the demands of environmental groups. So environmental activists were reporting difficulty reaching policymakers through those sorts of institutions that I mentioned earlier, or through seeking justice through the legal system of trying to take things through the courts. Russia has actually decent environmental laws on the books, but they're very difficult to enforce. And so environmental lawyers will talk about how important it is to take things to court, but understand that they're more likely to lose than win. And there's another quote on this slide from a domestic environmental NGO in northern Siberia about this phenomenon. This person said, in my view, the most effective, well, what should be the most effective are legal instruments. The law could be an effective instrument, but its effectiveness in the specific circumstances of contemporary Russia is decreasing. And the frustrations of this interviewee also point out what has been termed the de-environmentalization of Russia, that Russia has had some of these good environmental laws on the books, they're difficult to enforce, and the organs that have been charged with their enforcement have been gutted over time. And so we've seen those agencies become less powerful, and then you're less able to use those institutional mechanisms or legal mechanisms to reach your goals. Instead, we have seen the state increase repression, specifically of environmental activists. And so this information on the slide is from the Russian Social Environmental Union on pressure towards or repressive episodes towards environmentalists. And you see that the top city that we've seen a lot of repression in is Moscow, but it's all over the country that environmental activists have faced repression. In some of my own work, I'm also looking at how environmental NGOs, the formalized versions of environmental activism, have also faced state repression. So after the 2011-2012 protest movement, there were many laws passed during the summer of 2012 that made it more difficult for civil society to be active. One of those were amendments to the Federal Law 121 that have come to be called the Law on Foreign Agents, or these amendments on foreign agents that were passed in July 2012. What this did is it required any Russian NGO with foreign funding that engaged in very ambiguously defined political activity to have to register with the Russian Ministry of Justice as a foreign agent or face penalties for not doing so, really big fines for not voluntarily registering. But there are also consequences for organizations, whether they're registered or not. We're seeing a lot of self-censorship of environmental groups. Environmental groups are much less likely to then formalize because of this law. On the slide here is a picture from the Office of Baikal Environmental Wave in Irkutsk with some graffiti, misspelled, I might add, that is supposed to say Inostranny against with the heart USA, but it's misspelled. It says Inostranny. But it gives you an idea that environmental groups in particular have been targeted by the law. And I quantified that. So taking a look at data that I had collected and archived from the Russian Ministry of Justice, the online register that used to be publicly available is no longer. And their press releases, as of December 2020, 188 organizations have been designated as foreign agents. Some of them have managed to get off the list since then, either by closing down, liquidating their legal entity, or by appealing to the Ministry of Justice and getting that label removed. But you see that after rights organizations, human rights, electoral rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, and the like. Environmental organizations are the second most targeted. And you might think, oh, it's just 30 organizations. Is that really that big of a deal? But these are the top regional environmental organizations and those that came out of, many of them, that late Soviet environmental movement that were really seen as leaders within the field of environmental NGOs that have been impacted by this law. And so what has this meant for them? For these environmental groups, a lot of them have had to close, and they've closed in greater rates than those that work on rights. And so this evidence really points to the fact that addressing environmental concerns is not a top priority of the regime. And so that keeps it at a low level of benefit with the 2x2 that I showed before. So you would see low risk groups get neglected and high risk groups be repressed. And state actors, I think, perceive environmental activism as threatening for three main reasons. The first is elite politics, that often these environmental groups are uncovering official corruption that would break down some of those elite politics connections and ideas about sistema and the way that things work in Russian politics. The other is political economy. Russia is still a largely resource-based economy, and many of these environmental groups go up against state-directed goals for economic development. The third is the mass mobilizing potential of the environmental movement. Certainly there's the example of the late Soviet period and how much that environmental movement could attract people. And as environmental issues become more popular, that will be an increasing concern. So how have environmental activists dealt with that? So I have categorized in book-length work the different tactics that environmental activists use to try to reach their goals in interacting with the state. But because of the way that the state interacts with them, as I've talked about previously, it has made it very difficult for environmental activists to use these within the system tactics, like reaching policymakers through informal or formal institutions, through taking things through the law and courts, and has pushed them instead to using tactics that are more outside the system, that are seen as more threatening to state actors by using international support, trying to either get foreign funding or to leverage foreign influence to put pressure on domestic actors, or to go into the streets. And because the informal institutions and legal mechanisms are not effective, because the state has gone so strongly after international support and foreign funding, environmental activists are often left with mass mobilization. And so there's some additional evidence that I wanted to show toward environmentalists shifting their strategies in this direction. This is a quote on a slide from a grassroots environmentalist in the Moscow region, talking about their decision in the grassroots movement not to formalize. Everything was on the level of an initiative group and not an organization. And a few times we thought about registering as a social organization, but we decided not to, because now the law is built in such a way that if we became an organization, it would be easier to close, to extinguish. As an initiative group, we don't exist on paper. We're like a ghost. For that reason, it's impossible to shut us down. So this interviewee is really giving an impression that I got from several other environmental activists, that they're getting the message from the state to stay informal, to not formalize as NGOs because of things like the foreign agent law. And so that has pushed a lot of environmental activism onto the streets. And mass mobilization is often listed as one of the most effective options for change. And we've seen that in some of the recent movements. Pictured on the slide here is a movement to protect Khushtau, which is a sacred mountain from mining. Mass movement was a part of this movement's success. They were able to stop the mining operation because of the mass movement. So even though that can be more threatening for the state and the most risky for activists, it's largely seen as effective, and so environmentalists are using it a lot more, even those that had formerly been part of environmental NGOs. So that leads us to the last bit today about how environmental activism has intersected with formal party politics. And this is something that we've seen for several years. So calling back to that example of Khimki Forest, Yevgenia Chirikova, the leader of Khimki Forest, tried to run for mayor of Khimki twice. She ran in 2009 and she ran in 2012. In 2012, she ran with the help of Yabloko, one of the opposition parties in Russia. But what this did is it made it clear not only to Chirikova, but to people within her movement, within her team, of what political parties could offer for environmental activists. And so a lot of Khimki activists started then to form ties with opposition political parties, served as election observers after the 2011-2012 protests in particular, and some even decided to run for local office as candidates for these parties themselves, mostly as municipal deputies and mostly for Yabloko. And so we've seen this happen up to present day in other parts of Russia, not just in Moscow. Pictured on this slide is Krasimir Vransky, who is a leader of the group Beautiful St. Petersburg, which works on urban problems but includes environmental issues as well. He ran for governor of St. Petersburg in 2019, or he tried to. He was not able to register. And when asked about this, he said that it wasn't to win. Environmentalists don't do this to win, but it's to draw attention to their cause and to get some of the other benefits of running for office. There's a lot of support for these environmental activists running as candidates from political parties, and in particular, Yabloko. So Yabloko in its founding has a green faction within it, and there are several top Yabloko leaders today that also came from the environmental movement or came from environmental NGOs themselves. And so I picture two of them on this slide. The most important one that I want to draw your attention to is Nikolai Rybakov, who is the current leader of Yabloko on the federal level in Russia. He was previously the head of Bologna in St. Petersburg, which is a major environmental NGO there. So he was the director of that organization for many years, and now he's the head of Yabloko. The other person that I wanted to draw your attention to is on the other side of the slide, who is the head of Yabloko's Green Russia faction, and who herself has been a very heavily credentialed environmental activist. She was named a Time Hero of the Environment in 2007 for her work in Mayak against to get pollution victims recognition from the nuclear accident there. And so even within Yabloko, there are some top members who have these environmental creds and are specifically reaching out to environmental activists within their networks to run as Yabloko candidates. We're seeing examples of this now all over Russia. So last year, one of the major movements was a movement against sending all of Moscow's trash to a part of northern Russia called Shias in Arkhangelsk Oblast. And so there was a big movement to stop Shias, as it says in the sign. But in addition to that, the Stop Shias coalition decided to put forth their own candidate for governor. And so this is a picture of the person who did that, who was their candidate for governor and tried to get on the ballot. He was rejected from the ballot, not able to get on it. But this is just one example of many where environmental activists are trying to run for office to draw attention to their causes. And sometimes they're actually able to get on the ballot, and sometimes they're actually able to win. So Yabloko last year in the September elections ran lots of candidates, many of them environmentalists, across 36 regions of Russia. There is also the possibility for grassroots activists to become involved in opposition politics, not just running for office as a tool for furthering their movement's goals, but also then getting sucked up into opposition politics. We saw this happen with Yevgenia Chirikova, that she then became a face of the For Free Elections movement in 2011 and 2012. So she's pictured here on this slide in May 2012 with Ilya Yashin and Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. And we've seen something sort of similar happen with some of the municipal deputies that came out of park movements, like Yulia Galyamina, who is now very much central to the opposition movement in Moscow. She had run for municipal councillor earlier and had gotten elected in 2017. But now has been sort of catapulted into national level opposition politics. So there's quite a lot of a connection there from the environmental movement to top level opposition politics. So what are the advantages of party engagement for these environmental activists? They get increased resources from working with an established party that knows how to mobilize. They would get higher level media attention. Some of them talk about doing this specifically just to get media attention to their cause. Not that they expect to win, not that they care that much about party politics, but it would call attention to their cause. And there's also some legal protections that come along with that. One of those is the ability to hold rallies as a part of the campaign. So environmental activists will often use being a candidate in order to have those legal protections to do these things. But there are, of course, drawbacks to party engagement for the environmental movement itself. This could come in the form of decreased local legitimacy, of distracting from original movement goals, or creating divisions among the movement about disagreeing how political the movement should be. Should it stay close to its original goals, or should it move into this direction of formal politics? Within movements, there's great tension on those issues. And so there's a quote on this slide just to summarize that, from a grassroots activist in St. Petersburg involved in one of the park movements, talking about that decision just within the group of activists in St. Petersburg who were talking about running. He himself was running. People who are exclusively obsessed with politics, they are to me not civic activists, общественники, but enemies. We are never going to work together in any way. I am running myself right now, but we are not going to work with parties. Those are people who are motivated by political interests. So there's sort of this disconnect, even as trying to use elections as a way to further environmental goals, of trying to figure out when it's too far, when it's too political to be involved with political parties. And so I think there are really incredible implications as we watch for not only the Duma elections, but any other local level elections that are happening on that United Day of Voting, that political parties are actively recruiting environmental activists to run as candidates. And that includes regime-backed spoiler parties. And so we've seen in the run-up to the 2021 Duma elections, the Kremlin has put forth and registered a great number of parties. And some of those also include those that work towards environmental goals on paper. And so there have been rumors that the Kremlin is backing the Green Alternative, which is one of these newly registered parties, as a way to siphon the environmental vote away from opposition parties. So recognizing that has mass mobilizing potential, has electoral potential, and trying to figure out a way to spoil it. So moving forward, I would expect that these collaborations between party politics and environmental activists will continue. More environmental activists will run for local elections, but I think we should be wary before we assume they'll become stable members of the party. A lot of them are using this for instrumental goals and not really true believers in the party itself. Finally, in conclusion, the talk today focused on the state's neglect and repression of environmental activism, how that has created incentives for informality and mass mobilization within the movement in the last decade, and that environmental activists now face a challenge of balancing between staying true to their goals and engaging in politics, while also sustaining a longer-term movement to not let this moment slip away from them. And as environmental awareness grows, officials in Russia will have to address at least some of those grievances, or they're going to risk more protest or challenges at the ballot box. So thank you very much for the attention to the presentation today, and I look very much forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Very disciplined on the timing. Congratulations. So we have some good questions coming in. Let me just ask them roughly in the order they were received. So the first, you mentioned the fact that Russian environmental NGOs and different groups were working with foreign funding and organizations in that period of neglect, and that's created all sorts of problems with the foreign agent law that came into being a couple of years ago. There's a question, though: has there been a movement to connect local environmental activism to broader global environmental activism trends? And is the Kremlin inclined to push back on international environmentalism in Russia?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking it. One thing that got cut for time from the presentation is something that I'm really interested to see how it develops, and that's climate protest. So thinking about an international issue that has attracted a lot of attention, there has been a lot of youth activism around the world with respect to climate. the Fridays for Future movement, school strikes for climate, thinking about Greta Thunberg, that has not gained much momentum in Russia, but it has gained a little bit. So there are a few climate strikers, one particular who has gotten a lot of attention for being a solo climate striker, but some, especially during the pandemic, youth have taken to social media to strike for climate. And so we are seeing a little bit of that connection on climate protests to international movements. But we're not seeing a ton of that in the broader environmental movement within Russia. Certainly there are some international connections and collaborations with respect to, say, forest conservation, or say in like the Finnish part, as you get closer to the Finnish border, or tiger conservation in the Amur between like Russia and China, that there are some regional issues between countries that the environmental movement has worked on, that environmentalists have worked on, but that at the international level, we haven't seen that quite as much.
So we're going to alternate here, I think, between environmental questions and political science questions. The next one is a little more political sciencey, which is about mass mobilization in the authoritarian context, right? Given that authoritarian governments do everything they can to generally squash protest, how are we supposed to measure success of a movement in this kind of context? And related to that, let's see here, how would you define both the impact of the environmental movement on the regime and on the state, and also the risk to the movement from the state?
Also very interesting questions. I think for mass mobilization in an authoritarian context, we're seeing more scholarship that focuses on the variation that the state can take. And I think my work also falls into that category of understanding that some movements, some protest will be repressed, while others will be tolerated, maybe stopping short of encouraging protest, but certainly that there's more toleration of certain types of protest. And within the context of Russia, some of my work is comparative with China, that we see China, for example, a lot more tolerant of environmental protest, I think because they see it as less threatening, less risky, and because the state has taken an interest in solving environmental problems, whereas it's seen in a much more threatening way in the Russian context. And so I would expect for Russian environmentalists to face more repression, to have more problems with protesting in the Russian context than in the Chinese. And so I think the important thing to think about with authoritarian contexts is that each authoritarian regime might have some variation with respect to what the issue area is that the protesters have, that there could be differences in how much that is perceived as threatening to core state interests versus something that could be tolerated and used for its benefits. In terms of measuring success, I think that often has to be done on the movement's own terms. So trying to assess what were the movement's goals, what is it that they were trying to do, how close were they able to achieve those stated goals. Even with the Himki Forest movement, which if you don't know that story, the highway was built, they were able to get some concessions in that. So originally there were supposed to be all of these gas stations along the way, other stores along the way of the highway. And at least that was reduced. And as a result, destruction of the forest was reduced, the number of trees cut down reduced. And so even though the highway was still built, and that movement often gets labeled as a failure, I think there are some places where you can see that they still had an impact on the state. And that's important to consider as well, to try to think about how close they got to their own goals.
So we have a few more questions on how it is that we can assess the effectiveness of the environmental organizations. We have one from Moscow, and this person writes, I definitely observe a big change in society's attitude towards environmental issues and climate change problems. I can also see a difference in the position of the authorities. Regarding the environmental movement, what do you think? Which organizations, sorry, they slip away from me as other calls come in. Which organizations are more efficient, those working within the system or outside the system?
So that's a fantastic question as well. I would say that in the last couple of years, because we've seen, the reason why we've seen, I think, a lot of mass protest is because it is more effective. So if you talk to environmental activists, even the professionalized ones, the ones at environmental NGOs, they'll say, okay, we tried to talk to the policymakers first, right? We used these institutions, we worked within the system, we sued in court. But if none of those are working, that the advice tends to be, try to create the biggest movement that you can in the streets, because the understanding is that can be more effective. It's not always effective, but that we've seen some major breakthroughs because of mass protest. And I think that possibly we'll see the regime shift a little in its response as people become more aware and concerned about environmental issues. It won't be enough to just sweep it under the rug, so to say, that there will be, I think, more of a push to actually solve some of these grievances at a level that is still palatable to the authorities, but that maybe we'll see a movement from neglecting to starting to address some of these issues because it has gotten so popular.
So a related question is that given that there is a trend towards the informal approach, how can you assess capacity building? For example, did the successful movement in Chias result in ongoing networks or organizational capacity that could persist in the future? And can networking on social media substitute for organization building?
Yes, I see Laura Henry put that question in. So thank you for that, Laura. Obviously, she knows this very, very well, wrote a fantastic book about the environmental movement in Russia. And so this trend towards informality, if you look at it from the legal institutional registration process, it doesn't look like there's much of a legal trace, a legal entity trace of these groups. But that doesn't mean that they aren't building stable networks. And so one of the things that I think is a success of something like Khimki, even if the highway gets built, is that people learn from that experience and pass it on. So lots of the activists that were involved in that movement in particular then went to other activists around Moscow and taught them what they knew. Here's how you lie in front of a bulldozer. Here's how you build a tent city and block this construction from happening. Here's how you run for municipal council and win. That those skills are getting passed on, even as it stays informal, that those networks are there. They all know each other. And it can be very difficult to quantify because there's not much of a paper trail. But this is, I think, one of the examples of when qualitative work really matters, because you learn that by talking to them, by finding out, how is it that you are sustaining those connections over time? How did you learn how to do that? And then you can sort of build the network from that data.
So we have a question about whether those networks then extend beyond the environmental movement. Do environmental activists align with anti-war activists, for example, related to the Georgia and the Ukraine conflict, or are they more neutral?
I think that in terms of politics, environmental activists can be all over the spectrum. And this is why running for an opposition political party often becomes a major sticking point within the movement itself. Khimki, I keep using it as an example, but it's a good example, had a lot of people from different parts of the political spectrum. There were anarchists, there were nationalists, there were people that maybe would align with social democracy, there were people that aligned with, opposition politics. They agreed on the environmental issue. They did not agree on the politics. And so I think it's difficult to say that environmentalists align with a particular political view, because so many of them, this becomes a sticking point in trying to decide whether or not to be involved in formal party politics among members, is that often these are sort of meant to be apolitical. They are cross cleavage, if we want to use some political science terminology, that draw a lot of people from very different backgrounds together. So I wouldn't expect environmentalists to align with other, left-right politics necessarily in the Russian context.
All right, but I'm going to ask you another question about that anyway.
Sure.
So you showed the picture of the demonstration against mining on the sacred mountain. Where was that exactly?
So that's in Bashkortostan. It's Kushtow.
Okay. And the follow-up question is, do you see a nexus of ethno-nationalism interests and environmental interests in certain republics?
So that's fascinating, and that goes back, I think, to Jane Dawson's work on eco-nationalism. So this really fascinating book looking at some of the former Soviet republics and how the nationalist movement also used environmental mass mobilization at the end of the Soviet period to as sort of a Trojan horse for their nationalist concerns. And so I think certainly that could happen again. We've seen it happen before, and it was very successful. Um, I don't know to what extent we've seen, besides the Kuchtau example. I'm trying to think of other. I suppose when it comes to, there is even some sort of like regionalism that goes along with this. So maybe not just ethno-nationalism, but some like regional pride that goes along with this. So the Shias movement, for example, we don't want Moscow telling us what to do up here in the Russian north. You see a lot of that language further out east about not wanting Moscow to tell us what to do. That even beyond the ethno-national interests, that there are also regional, like center local divides that are salient in those moments as well.
So we're talking a lot about how the environmental movements basically try and get the state's attention so that they'll pay attention to environmental degradation. And how effective is the government in enforcing environmental regulations? And have you noticed any shift either in general over the past decade or in response to some of the environmental movements?
So I think the question should also be whether or not we see this as part of national policy versus these local issues that get solved. And so we're seeing more often that it's the local issues that get solved and not that broader national movement towards fixing some of the systemic problems that create these problems in the first place. There is some lip service that's being paid now to environmental issues. You'll see it comes up in Putin's presidential address. It came up in the most recent address quite a lot, that there are state attempts for things like the Year of the Environment, for some other, good-looking PR on the environment. But some of the fundamental changes that would need to happen to the system to make sure that these things don't continue to occur aren't happening.
In one of the things that I read recently, I saw that it's youth activism that's driving some of the environmental movement in certain cases into the protest. We have a question about the extent to which environmentalists have tried and had any success in getting ecology issues into the curriculum at universities and schools. And is that driving youth activism at all?
I don't know. That is a fantastic question, something that I would certainly be interested to look into. I don't know to what extent those issues have been covered in the curriculum. There are many environmental NGOs where this is part of their work, that they work on environmental education. It's less risky, tends to be something that is more encouraged by the state, that maybe they're more likely to get a presidential grant to work on environmental education. Again, I'm not sure about a systemic change of including that in the curriculum, but certainly that there would be one-off programs run by some of these environmental NGOs for environmental education.
Here's another tricky question for you. Has Navalny's growing profile and related public protests changed the state's calculus about environmental protests? And might they be less tolerant of all types of protests going forward?
I think that, so there are places where we've seen Navalny activists and environmental activists sort of overlap. One of those is the Shias movement in Arkhangelsk. One of the main leaders of Stop Shias also used to be the head of the Navalny campaign in Arkhangelsk. And he has described this as seeing environmental issues as not only environmental, but also political. And sometimes there is that crossover for a small number of environmental activists to see environmental problems not just as that local issue that needs to be solved as a one-off, but understanding that it comes from a systemic problem. And that tends to draw them into opposition politics, to align with Navalny, to align with some of the opposition parties and politicians that would definitely make them part of who the regime is worried about. But the vast majority of environmental activists don't make that jump. They don't make that shift. And so I think that I don't know that I would necessarily expect the regime to be going strongly after environmental groups because of what happened with Navalny. I think that that is still tenuous because of the fact that environmental issues are now more on the public's mind, that these are grievances, and often using some of Laura's work, Laura Henry's work, thinking about this from Chinese politics as well, of rightful resistance, of this being something that is very difficult from a framing point of view of the state to ignore, that this is something that the state should care about and should show at least a little bit that they're going to address these problems. And so I wouldn't expect to see quite a lot of repression of environmental movements, particularly if they're not systemic, if they're not on this like heavily opposition politics side of things.
Although your data on the NGOs that have been targeted as foreign agents, right? You had said that the environmentalists are number 2 after the rights organizations. So that does suggest that there are a lot more environmental organizations, and so they're only tackling a small percentage of them, or they are perceived as being potentially threatening.
I think they are perceived as potentially threatening. So maybe I should clarify. I do think that the state sees environmental groups, and particularly foreign funded ones, as threatening. But the mass movements, say the group of local citizens in Kuchtau that want to protect their mountain, or the people in Chias who are upset about the landfill, that if they're sort of regular citizens making regular claims on the state, that can be very difficult for the state to just completely repress and ignore.
So I noticed that you had written a paper earlier about how certain frames affect individual perceptions and their willingness to mobilize for certain social movements. And have you seen a shifting in the frames used by the Russian environmental activists to get those individuals out on the street?
Yes, so this is some early work of mine looking at framing of the environment versus the economy in the US context of along the Marcellus Shale. So looking at fracking and anti or pro-fracking groups, depending on how that issue is framed, as for the environment or for the economy. And certainly I think that some of the language that was heard early on about the environment, for why maybe Russians didn't care about it earlier, or why regular people weren't as concerned, was because of economic concerns. And there's a lot of work connecting, as people end up in middle class, they start caring about other things like the environment. And even though we've seen Russia have serious consequences from it in economic crises in the last couple of years, that they have seen GDP per capita at a high level compared to the early post-Soviet period. And so people are caring more about these second order concerns, moving beyond just thinking about their economic circumstances and thinking more about the environment, kind of as we would expect anywhere else around the world. And so I think I've also seen a shift in how much people then are not talking about its economy versus the environment, but thinking about the environment as something that's just as important as economic development, or that should not be forsaken for economic development. That language has shifted as well.
So that sounds like it might be one of the differences between what we see in the US and Russia, right? In the US, there's kind of this strong anti-climate change movement, which argues in many cases that, in order to support the economy, we can't let ourselves be distracted by, problems like pollution and environmental degradation. Are you not seeing that in Russia?
I think with respect to climate change, you certainly are. So climate often gets framed as either it's a foreign concern, or it's something where it would make Russia weak compared to the rest of the world. So maybe it's foreign concocted in a way to hurt Russia. And on the other hand, it is just not something that there's still a lot of climate change denial in Russia. Even among some environmental activists that I spoke to, some of them working at major environmental NGOs did not necessarily believe that climate change was human caused or as big a big problem. So I think there's still a disconnect specifically on climate change versus individual environmental issues, sort of everyday environmentalism, again, to use something Laura has been working on.
Well, we can't let a seminar go by without talking about COVID. So I wanted to ask if you've seen any impacts from the COVID pandemic and the Russian officials' response in terms of growing or maybe lessening attention to environmental problems?
So I think what really struck me at the beginning of the pandemic is that I was watching, in particular, Shias. This major movement against the plan to have all of Moscow's trash sent to a landfill in the northern part of Russia. That I thought, oh, the pandemic has hit. They won't be able to mobilize in the streets anymore, and that was not the case. That there were still protests that happened, for better or for worse, in person, maskless protests, and that sort of continued throughout 2020. And we saw that with opposition protests as well. And this movement in Kushtow that was very effective, that also happened in 2020. And so I think I was expecting the pandemic to have a bigger impact on the environmental movement, and in particular, that mass mobilization component, than it has. So that surprised me as something that the pandemic really didn't change that much.
Have you seen a pivot to greater interest in health issues and the health implications of pollution and trash dumps and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think some of the major movements in the last couple of years have been about trash incineration, because that can put all sorts of nasty stuff into the air. And so there has been a lot of concern about connecting that then to human health issues. Again, thinking beyond just those basic survival first order concerns to this second order concern of not only wanting to have a nice environment to look at, but understanding that there are human health concerns to having a polluted environment. And there have been several movements about air pollution in Siberia, in Krasnoyarsk, that are tied to health. And so that maybe also goes to that question earlier about how have some of the frames shifted. And I think that has been a much more successful frame in the last couple of years to tie environmental pollution to human health concerns.
Mm-hmm. So we have just a few minutes left. Let me pull all the way back from the individual to not just the nation state, but bilateral relations. And ask, given that relations between the United States and Russia are so bad and that the foreign agent law hasn't helped in any way, do you see any areas where environmental common interests might be a platform for the US and Russia to engage in perhaps more productive dialogue than sanctions and insults?
I think that this is something that comes up often with US-China ties, that climate change would be a great place for the US and China to work together. That China has sort of put itself in a position as a global leader on climate negotiations. That's not typically something we've seen Russia do. Even where Russia has agreed to greenhouse gas emissions in the past, although I see there's a question about the most recent plans, it tends to agree to cuts that are already in Russia's interest. They're pegged to 1990 levels. Often that means Russia can still continue to pollute compared to 1990 levels and not have to change anything. And so it might look good on the surface, but if you drag in a little bit deeper, that there usually aren't really big sacrifices being made to cut greenhouse gas emissions on that level. So I'm a little bit skeptical about seeing Russia enter that conversation at the same level that China has, thinking about some of my other work, to be able to work with the US on that. Honestly, I wonder if there would still be more bilateral ties, sort of people-to-people ties on these specific areas of environmental issues. So thinking about forestry, there's still a lot of exchange happening between, say, the US Forest Service and their Russian counterparts, or conservation, that some of these areas have still seen a lot of collaboration between the US and China, or the US and Russia. But I don't know that I see climate change as being that issue.
What about in the area of green infrastructure? Like, is civil society in Russia pushing for more construction, for example? Would that possibly be an area of common interest or common experience?
It's a good idea. I think that this is not something that I've seen them traditionally take up. It doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. And certainly there is more attention to what consequences might come to Russia from climate change. Scientists have been warning about melting permafrost and what that means for Russian infrastructure for a very long time. And we've only seen it sort of come up to the surface of national dialogue in the last year or so. And so perhaps that will be an opening where the state is more interested, because it wants to fix its infrastructure, in working with environmentalists and possibly working with foreign environmentalists on fixing that infrastructure. I think that's a decent idea. I just haven't seen it yet.
All right, well, let's leave it there on an upbeat, on a positive note. Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth Plantan, for talking to us about the Russian environmental movement and how it intersects with the Russian political system. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.